Okay, so my talk is literacy and forced migration. This is a very new project for me, so I don't have any findings or conclusions. But first of all, I'm going to just give a background of two theoretical concepts that are really key to the project, which is literacy sponsorship by Deborah Brandt and Michel Foucault's late career concept of governmentality, which he didn't write a lot about, but others have kind of written extensively because it's really relevant for kind of globalization, issues of migration, and things like that. So briefly, to define sponsorship, it's really pretty obvious. It's very easy theory to use. It's reading and writing. How is it supported? But it's also looking at how it's recruited, regulated, suppressed, and withheld. It's very much a labor perspective on literacy, reading and writing. And then there's Foucault with a cat. And governmentality is really about power and how it's about the state power, but it's also about individual power. So it's about governing mentalities and what it means to be governed or governable. So it's very kind of complex, abstract. So I like to align these two theories together because they have very similar kind of definitions of complexity and kind of multi-perspective, multiple actors involved about recruitment, regulating, analysis, procedures. And so I'm continually drawn to the way governmentality seeks to understand what Foucault would call an ensemble of practices. And this really relates to refugee resettlement because there's so many actors, agencies, parties, public perspectives, opinions involved. So some of the stakeholders in terms of refugee resettlement include the UN. They write the international law. Nation states, they interpret the international law. NGOs, they're all about advocacy for rights. And then we have communities, local state agencies, the distribution of resources, and the refugee voices themselves. So a typical relationship between the state and the NGO is that they share responsibility for distributing resources. But Iowa Ong in 2006 observes that refugees have had to look outside the state for securing their rights. And that'll come up again later. So one way this happens is through the UN Global Compact. This is a way to pair local NGOs with the private sector. So this is a new thing that's happening. Companies kind of getting involved in refugee resettlement and refugee camps. The UN Global Compact operates according to 10 principles. I've just highlighted 2 here. I'm not sure why I put principle 10, but they do a lot of focus on corruption. But the main one is to protection of internationally claimed rights. So a couple of examples. Microsoft of the Global Compact. Microsoft has been working with the Cherokee Nation to preserve Cherokee languages through software and technology. And then IKEA is really big in the refugee regime. And one of the things IKEA is also doing is to try to stem child labor. But this IKEA story, you might be familiar with it. It's very interesting. They built collapsible, foldable shelters as an alternative to the military tents that have been used since World War II for refugee camps. But if you notice here in January 2017, IKEA won a Design of the Year award for the flat pack refugee shelter. And in April, a few months later, they recalled a bunch of the shelters because they didn't meet fire codes and they lacked proper access for disabilities and things like that. Okay, another company involved is Pearson, and we're all familiar with Pearson because they do the Common Core and they come to our door sometimes. So Pearson, this is a very interesting Wired article about Pearson taking over the globe with private education. Right now they're working with Save the Children to deliver, and that's their word, effective quality education to refugee children. This is mostly in the form of an app and technology provided to refugee camps. So this is kind of an interesting partnership. Now some critiques of Pearson are that teaching in Pearson's model kind of becomes a low-paid service that requires little training. And some of the things they're experimenting with, critics fear they're going to use in the US after they kind of experiment in the refugee camps. Some other critiques of this idea of like delivering education. Robert Phillipson is a linguist who kind of critiques the donor-recipient model, where education is seen as a commodity that is exported from one place to the next. And so these critiques, they kind of deny local grassroots and just local agency, local self-governance in terms of education. So there's a lot of schools that get hurt by kind of the private enterprise coming in and offering free or low-cost schooling. So I just wanted to look back to that Iowa On quote to show how refugees now must continue to look beyond the state for protection of their rights. And the right to education is one of the core fundamentals that refugees are supposed to be guaranteed. And that's it. It's a work in progress. So there's some sources, and thanks a lot.